The seminar today is about how to identify opportunities in turbocharged cars today. The blow-off valve is progressively becoming something that's kind of an easy bolt-on, and unless retailers know how to bolt on the right part and identify what part to sell, it's going to be very difficult to actually be able to capture those sales ahead of time. So Synapse makes an innovative compressor bypass valve, blow-off valve, whatever you want to call it. There's many names for pretty much the same part. And what we're doing is we've developed a technology that's called synchronic. This technology has been licensed to the Tier 1 OEMs to try to get it into OEM production cars. So that's kind of the power in the technology itself. So what I'll go over is kind of how to identify what a blow-off valve is to begin with, and then secondly, what can you do to sell something to that customer. So whether you call it a blow-off valve, diverter valve, compressor recirculation valve, BOV, DV, dump valve, whatever it might be, it's all the same thing. It's just going to be a different name depending on the customer. So your European car customer is going to want to call it a diverter valve. Your British guys are going to call it a dump valve. So you just kind of have to understand what they're saying because it's all basically the same device. Even if you're venting it to atmosphere, you're recirculating it, ultimately it's all the same device. So those are the terms that you want to be familiar with first. Secondly, where does it fall in the system? So if you know how the turbo's system works, you've got your basic turbo here, the red's your hot side, the blue's your cold side, right? The blow-off valve or diverter valve will always sit on the cold side of the system. The big difference will be, does it sit before the intercooler or does it sit after the intercooler? Either way, it's going to do the same function, okay? Ideally, you want it to be located as close to the throttle plate as possible because that is the thing that actually closes and creates the overpressure in the intercooler piping that the blow-off valve is going to relieve the pressure from. So in the system, you're going to find the device on the cold side of the system, right here. Sometimes it will be electronically controlled, which actually almost all new cars moving forward are going to be electronically controlled by a solenoid. So there's an ECU that's smart enough to know, am I making too much boost, am I not making too much boost, etc., and is going to control the valve and what the valve is doing. So you're going to want to identify how this device is controlled by the system. Easily enough, you can take the line pressure that's controlling the diverter valve and connect it straight to the intake manifold so that it will reference exactly what the engine is doing. Or you can disconnect that line that's connected to the electronic solenoid and control the diverter valve. Either way, our technology will work with OEM system so that all the fail-safe mechanisms that are in there for overboost and all of that will still be retained. And a good example is the Hyundai Genesis application that we've been pretty successful in. A majority of the customer base, they ask for the product. Even if their kit maker is using somebody else's product, they typically say, send me the kit without that other competitive product and just put the Synapse one in there. Diverter valves typically have been looked at as kind of a dumb product, but it is actually a pretty complicated piece of aerodynamics that you got to deal with. And if you look at the amount of analysis that we've gone through working with the OEM on how it works, how fast it works, we're looking at milliseconds. We're not looking at tenths of a second. We're looking at thousandths of a second response. So that's how important it is in terms of being able to keep the turbo speed going between gears, getting rid of closed throttle surge, all that kind of stuff. So it's actually a pretty complicated little device. But what is not complicated is figuring out how to sell one. Because all you've got to do is identify what kind of flange the OEM has. Once you identify the flange, you look in our system and see what flange would adapt the product to it, and it's a bolt-on. So in a lot of our applications, we actually have written down Mitsubishi Evo, Subaru BRZ, or Ford F-150 EcoBoost, whatever it might be. If you're a shop, you know the biggest headache is taking on projects. It could take 4 weeks for something that you thought was only going to take 2 weeks. It could take 6 weeks, whatever it might be. But with blow-off valves, it's like putting in a drop-in filter many times. A little bit longer, a little more complicated, but it is the one part you're going to put in. People are going to feel good that they spent the money on the performance. But the key is trying to identify it first. So I'm going to show some examples of OEM flanges. This is probably the highest volume diverter valve out there. 2 hose ends. You hook up a hose to it, 1 inch in diameter. Bosch is the maker of the part. You'll find these typically on any European car. Some older Fords. Ford hasn't had that much turbo before, but you find this on some Fords. But for Volkswagen, Audi, BMW, yeah, the newer BMWs have this too. This is what you're going to be identifying out there, okay? So once you see this, you go, hose end on either side. I just hook up some silicone on either side, a couple hose clamps, and I'm done. And actually, uninstalling this is probably just as easy. There may be tamper-proof clamps that you got to deal with, but you just snip those off, and you'll be able to get to it functionally. Here's a second type. This is made by Mitsubishi, and when I say Mitsubishi, I don't mean Mitsubishi, the car company. It's one of their divisions that makes Mitsubishi valves. So, and it's a plastic valve. And in any one of these plastic valves, the biggest problem is that they have a high propensity to leak. And when the turbo leaks, boost, it just forces the turbo to work harder. And really, most people think, oh, you're just bleeding off a little bit of boost pressure. You know, I'm still making the same amount of boost, I'm still making the same amount of power. But what they don't understand that the scientists in the lab have found is that the back pressure goes up. And when the back pressure goes up, the scavenging in the engine gets worse. And this is actually a link that we identified as Synapse and are currently patenting globally to try to identify and solve that problem for people. So this is a Mitsubishi type. This is really simple again because you've got your hose end on one side, hose end on the other side. You just got to figure out what size hose. But when you see this, you've got to trace in the system, okay, here's the cold side, here's the turbo. Follow the tube until you get to the valve, and then you'll understand, here's the in of it, here's the out of it. That's about as simple as it gets. It doesn't really get any harder than that. This is another type. Instead of having a 90-degree, you're going to have an inline, and this is an old Mazda RX-7 diverter valve. It's got a hose end on either side at 3/4 inch. Again, pretty easy to adapt to. You just got to get hose ends and maybe a bent piece of silicone to be able to adapt our device on, and you'll have a good functioning valve. And these are really easy to install. You take off the vacuum line, you take off the hoses, you bolt it on. Your shop has just made $500 on labor and the part. The guy's in and out in a couple of hours, and he's happy. Now, there's been a trend in the 2000s where the OEMs, the car makers, have been putting the compressor valve on the actual compressor of the turbo. So it's before the intercooler. You could think of it as kind of the hot side of the charge. But they're doing that really to save money. And what they've found is the efficiency actually is not as high as what the Japanese have been doing forever, which is putting it after the intercooler, so that they're moving away from that again as far as trends goes. So you're going to find applications where the valve is actually located on the turbo. But if you look, this thing has a round circular flange, and likely we're going to have an adapter flange for it. You take that off, you bolt it off, you bolt ours on, you're done, you made the sale. The thing's not leaking boost, the guy feels the horsepower. This is another type of on-compressor diverter valve. It's made by Mitsubishi. Yeah, that one's made by Mitsubishi. This is what you find on the compressor housing of a Hyundai. Okay, and it's very similar to the one that you find from General Motors too that was on the Cobalt SS's. It's on compressor. All it is a piece of rubber and a spring behind it, so there's not a whole lot of complexity to it. And when you start to try to make boost, this is actually the same one that's on the SRT4 as well. When you start to make boost, they start to leak. You don't get as good a performance. So, you know, the key here is identify what you're working with. Once you know what you're working with, figure out what flange you need to get, bolt it on, and then, you know, you're good and happy. Now, we're going into the Synapse adapter flanges. So this shaped flange is the exact same flange shape as the OEM flange for the Subaru on the top mount. So we've actually made the flange so that you can take this, bolt it on, bolt our product onto it, and be able to have an easy bolt-on application without fabrication or dealing with anything else. This is our 1 1/4 inch hose end adapter. And so you can actually take our universal diverter valve and simply take it and put these adapter flanges on and be able to make it work with anything you need to. This is a Greddy flange, and this is a good example because you're going to have customers that are going to come into the shop that are already going to have a blow-off valve. Either it's broken, they don't like it, they want a different color, whatever it is. You need to be able to have a way to convert that customer from what they have on the car now to what they want. And so like for the Greddy and the HKS and the tile blow-off valves, we actually have adapter flanges to say, oh, okay, you don't have to cut and weld. Just take our adapter flange, bolt it on the charge pipe, ready to go. So it's a really, really simple deal to be able to get the customer a new piece of technology, make them happy, and not have to involve yourself in another long-term project. Even if that long-term project is like 2 days, it turns it into a couple of hours instead of a couple of days. And so this is an example of what our valve looks like with these flanges on them. So they're interchangeable. It's like Legos. You just take it off one, you put the retaining clip on, and now you're able to go out there and bolt it straight on the application. So really, being able to sit there and make a sale to a turbo customer, and if you don't know the statistics already, okay, 50%, the F-150 is probably the #1 selling vehicle in America today. Ford projected 15% of sales would be EcoBoost with turbos. Awesome. Customers were buying in excess of 50%. So they were way off their projections. And today, more than half of all new F-150s sold are turbocharged. And by 2016, 75% of all new cars sold will have a turbocharger on them. And this is going to be one of those first very simple and easy bolt-on. The bolt-on process used to be wheel, tire, air intake, exhaust, right? You've got a fifth thing to add in there, which is the blow-off valve. It's very easy to make a sale. It's very easy to help the customer get what they're looking for, and they actually make horsepower out of it, you know, by giving them something that doesn't leak. And the key is just really identifying what the application is and how to bring the customer the solution. And that's about it for the presentation. And thank you for coming today.